generally what we're finding is that the carbon footprint of Irish grain is very low, somewhere in the order of 200 kilos of CO2 per tonne. And some of our international competitors could have figures of 1,000. So Irish grain is very carbon efficient, and that is to a large part driven by the high yields that people achieve. So ultimately I would hope that it would provide a marketing advantage to Irish grain.
Following on from last week's episode from the Teagasc Crops and Technology Open Day held in Oak Park, Carlow, we're continuing our coverage by hearing from a number of other researchers and presenters who were involved on the day. You're very welcome to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you enjoy the podcast, we'd really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. In this episode, you'll hear from John Spink on the AgNav programme, Richie Hackett on rye, and Stephen Kildea chatting about disease control in wheat. Sometimes it takes a looming deadline to push a big piece of work over the line, and the Open Day at Oak Park provided just that. The event marked the official launch of the Tillage AgNav programme by the Minister of Agriculture. The tool is a result of many years of research and designed to create a carbon decision support calculator tailored specifically for Irish tillage farmers. I caught up with John Spink, head of CELIP in Teagasc, to find out more about the programme.
So AgNav is a system, Michael, that will calculate the carbon footprint of whatever you're producing. So initially it was per kilogram of beef or per kilogram of milk, and you can then look at scenarios as to how you could reduce that carbon footprint. And what we've just launched today is the tillage part of AgNav. So a grower can put in information about how they've grown the crop, so things like the cultivations used, how much fertiliser and what type of fertiliser, and their yields, and it will calculate the carbon footprint of that grain.
So from that, there's lots of other different calculators out there. People talk about cool farm tools, and there could be, a dozen more out there at least. Why would an Irish farmer use the Tillage AgNav in comparison to, say, an international kind of one that's out there?
Michael, over the years, we've done quite a lot of work within Teagasc to look at the emissions associated with various things that you do in terms of growing a crop. So the emissions associated with applying fertiliser and the like. So what we've done is we've developed a tool, and it was published in the Irish Journal of Agriculture and Food, which incorporates as many of those Irish emissions factors as possible. So it gives you a much closer or more accurate estimate of the carbon footprint of your grain than if you used a tool that was used elsewhere in the world, which just uses international defaults for those emissions.
So for a farmer today who's out there and listening to this, can a farmer get access to that directly themselves, or what way does it work?
A farmer, it's not quite live for farmers yet, so today we were showing people the data input system. I think middle of July it will be live, that farmer can register. They can go in, they can put each of their crops in, and it will calculate the carbon footprint for them.
In terms of the input, is it difficult? Is it going to take long for a normal farmer to put in their data for 3 or 4 crops?
I don't think so. Now, whether farmers think it is a different matter. But look, we've tried it with a good few farmers, and I think obviously the first time you do it, or for the first crop you do it, it might take 20 minutes to put the information in for a crop. And I think what people have found then after that is maybe 10 minutes for each subsequent crop. So the system's set up so that if you're all a plough-based system and you put in your first crop, which say is winter wheat, and you say I've ploughed it and you've put in the types of fertiliser you use, it automatically populates the next crop with that information. So you have less to put in. But once you're used to it, it's relatively easy to put it in, and we've kept the information as limited as is necessary to get an accurate carbon footprint.
So the big elements that you're really looking for is the type of crop, the type of yield that's out of the crop, fertilisers, that kind of thing.
Fertilisers, and then machinery operations, because it's the emissions from the fertiliser and the machinery use are the main things that contribute to the carbon footprint of a cereal. And
the thing that people would struggle in is putting in the agrochemicals. How difficult is that?
We don't put them in, Michael. The agrochemicals account for less than 1% of the carbon footprint of the crop, or of the carbon used to produce the crop. So we're not asking people to put in the main agrochemical inputs. As you say, it's very complicated. So what we've done is we've allowed for the carbon, the embedded carbon in the agrochemicals that you would use for each of the crops in the crops cost and returns. We've put those in. If you were using 50% more, it would add less than 0.5% to your carbon footprint. So it's really not worth the effort of growers having to put in all that detailed information when it might alter your carbon footprint by 1 kilogram per tonne.
So some farmers be saying, oh, that's brilliant, we can put that in and get a carbon bit out the far side. Others might say, so what? What's that going to do for me? Where is this going? What's the point in doing this?
Well, I suppose the point is that the people who ultimately use our grain, they have a target to reduce the carbon footprint of the products they produce. So obviously they're wanting to know the carbon footprint of their raw materials, and I think we've piloted the calculation system on a good number of crops and a good number of farms before producing AgNav. And generally what we're finding is that the carbon footprint of Irish grain is very low, somewhere in the order of 200 kilos of CO2 per tonne. And some of our international competitors could have figures of 1,000. So Irish grain is very carbon efficient, and that is to a large part driven by the high yields that people achieve. So ultimately I would hope that it would provide a marketing advantage to Irish grain going into products, and therefore be sought by the end users. And if a product is sought, hopefully that will result in a premium to the growers.
So from that point of view, how many people need to do it before a buyer of grain could establish, well, this is what the figure is for the grain that I buy?
That's really up to the buyers. Obviously, as I said, we've tried to keep it simple. What I would hope is as many tillage farmers as possible use it. The more that use it, the more the more accurate the figure we have, the average figure we have for Ireland is. But I think ultimately it's likely to be built into sustainability schemes and sustainability bonuses, for example, by the co-op buyers of Irish grain.
Okay. How acceptable is the AgNav now on an international stage? As in, can a company who, say, Diageo or somebody who's buying grain that is certified by, or has went through the AgNav and it's got a figure on it, can they hold their heads high and kind of say it's the same as any other cool farm tools out there? This is a really good figure and it stands up internationally. The model that we've developed within Teagasc is done to all of the international standards for doing life cycle assessment. It's published in a scientific journal, so it's been refereed and been accepted in a scientific journal. One of the elements of any of these things is to have an audit of the data, and what we're hoping currently is, well, because most tillage farmers are using the Irish Grain Assurance Scheme, which is what the buyers are using, that will be the method of auditing the data. That once someone's had their IGAS audit, that will be the auditing. Now, look, ultimately we will look at, for example, at getting it registered or approved by the Carbon Trust, but it's been developed according to all of the international standards. So the next step then is really to try and encourage as many farmers as possible to get in, do their figure, see what it's like, and it'll give a little bit of feedback to those farmers in terms of what the figure is, but how to improve it as well.
The improvement part will come later, Michael. As I said, the figures for Irish grain are very low anyway. It's actually difficult to see how you reduce them, apart from things like straw incorporation, and we will build in the carbon sequestered through the growing of cover crops. We don't have that there currently. But the oak crops that we've looked at already, those which have had straw incorporated have been close to or below zero carbon footprint, which is a huge thing. Huge thing.
In fairness, if all the other industries could do that, we'd be hurling all together.
Well, we hope they don't all do it, because that'll be our advantage gone. So, but as I say, I think that would be a huge thing. If we could start marketing porridge, Irish porridge oats internationally, and essentially say there's a zero carbon footprint.
Sure. John, thanks very much for your time. Hopefully people come into it and interact with it over the next couple of months. Thanks, John. So my thanks to John and the wider team for all of their hard work in bringing AgNav to the stage. Farmers will be able to access AgNav through their local signpost advisor over the coming weeks. One crop that's been gaining ground in recent years is winter rye. Richie Hackett, a crops researcher in Oak Park, has been studying the crop over the past 5 years. I stopped by Richie's stand to get an insight on how farmers can get more from winter rye, and I first asked Richie if rye yields were comparable to winter wheat yields.
Yeah, well, in the work we've done, that yes, it is very competitive with first wheat. On occasions it will out-yield it, but it'll generally be as good as a first wheat. And if we compare it to the second wheat, it'll usually out-yield the second wheat because it's got better take-all tolerance than wheat. So it'll definitely do better than a second wheat.
And in terms of the time of sowing, it can be sown around the same as wheat or earlier, or what way does that work out?
Yeah, no, I would say earlier. So typically if you were sowing your wheat in early October, you can sow your rye from mid-September onwards. So you have that option of spreading your sowing dates when you're growing rye. So yeah, it's definitely an option there.
Okay. Any considerations then in the crop following rye? Can you go back with another rye, for instance, or go back in with winter barley, or what do you do?
Yeah, there's a few things to take into account, I suppose. First of all, rye isn't a break crop for take-all, so the follow-on crop will be at risk of take-all, so you need to take that into account. And I suppose the other thing is volunteers. So the volunteers can be very visible in the following crop if they're there, and it can be very difficult to get rid of the remaining seed before a winter barley crop. So we would normally recommend sowing a break crop like beans or oilseed rape, where you can control the volunteers, or else a spring crop where you can cultivate the ground in the autumn and let the seed chit over the winter period and get rid of the volunteers in that way.
Okay, so we're going to get to market in a second, which has proven a little bit trickier, but we'll get to that in a second. Just in terms of a crop within a rotation to leave you a margin, where does it stack up between that winter barley and winter wheat scenario?
Well, look, I suppose in terms of costs, probably the best way to put it is a sort of winter barley type costs in terms of the full season worth of costs, but you're often getting winter wheat yields. So that makes it a very competitive crop, and you're also getting a very good yields compared to either winter wheat or winter barley. So you're getting the yields with sort of reasonable costs. So that makes it a very profitable crop, or potentially profitable crop in the rotation.
And from what you've seen, is it stable year on year in terms of getting that good consistent yield one year after the next?
Yeah, we've found it to be reasonably stable, more stable, say, than winter barley year on year. But yeah, so yield does fluctuate up and down like any crop, but it's less fluctuation than some of the other crops that we work with.
Okay, so finally on the market, which has been kind of tricky enough kind of to develop, it's slow, let's put it that way, but there still is as big a market out there for rye potentially in all of the elements in the same way as wheat or barley.
Yeah, potentially there is a market for it. I suppose the one thing I would say about rye is don't sow it unless you have a market for it before you sow it. But in terms of markets, like it's particularly suitable for pig feed, and there's a lot of interest from the pig producers on that end. But it can be used in ruminant diets as well, and that's probably something that we need to look a bit more into. And I suppose there are other smaller markets as well in terms of human consumption for flour and bread making and that sort of thing. And the drinks industry are using some of it in producing the likes of rye whiskey. So there are a number of markets, but the animal feed one is probably the one that we need to work on to promote and expand that market for the crop.
The bit, Richie, that strikes me about this particular crop in comparison to, say, winter wheat is the fact that it seems to be relatively disease resistant, and we're turning up with lots of yet something else in winter wheat this year with yellow rust. It does seem to be that little bit more stable, and maybe it should be looked upon more seriously as a crop in an Irish circumstance.
Yeah, certainly to date we found that it's got quite good disease resistance, and I mean the disease it gets like brown rust and mildew, we've still reasonably good chemistry to control those, so that's a positive. I suppose we always need to be cognizant of the fact that if the area expanded substantially, maybe the disease pressure would change a little bit, but at the moment, yeah, it's got a very good disease profile and relatively easy to control diseases compared to, say, your winter wheat crop, which is proving some difficulty in terms of disease control in the current climate.
Okay, Richie, thanks very much. So finally I caught up with Stephen Kildea, a pathologist in Teagasc, to talk about wheat diseases, in particular how yellow rust has changed this season. I began by asking Stephen why yellow rust has become more of a challenge this year.
So I think there's two factors at play this year, and first one is that we've had a really dry spring, which has really been favourable for rust development. Typically we'll get probably a wetter spring that doesn't favour rust. So March was exceptionally dry, that favoured rust. The second thing is probably a little bit more complicated and has a bit more of implications for how we control yellow rust, in that there has been an apparent breakdown of a resistance gene called YR15. Now that resistance is across an awful lot of material, a lot of varieties, and from our sort of perspective, you're talking varieties such as your Champion and your Dawson. These varieties this time last year were spotless of yellow rust, and all of a sudden that really high level of resistance has broken and they're now very, very susceptible. So that combination of a breakdown in the resistance with the ideal weather conditions has meant that actually we are seeing quite a bit of yellow rust in various different untreated plots.
So, Stephen, now, from what I was reading across the season, this was spotted quickly, I suppose, out in the UK early on in the season. Did it spread from the northeast of the UK, or was it spontaneous over here at the same time, or how did it spread so fast?
That's something that we don't fully know yet, Michael, being honest, and I'd sort of leave the jury out in that to say where that came from. But what we know is that when it did get going, it spread very, very rapidly. And it's not just the UK, it's not just Ireland, it's all across Northern Europe, from France into Belgium, into the Netherlands and up into Denmark. So there's quite a lot of spread of this specific strain quite quickly. For us, from an Irish perspective, I suppose we started to get reports back in the start of April of yellow rust in varieties that typically wouldn't have had yellow rust. As I say, something like your Champion and your Dawson and your Fitzroy, these varieties had it. Now, I can't say for definite that all these varieties that we're seeing yellow rust in the trials had actually got that YR15, but we're seeing them in varieties that would not have had yellow rust previously.
So from the department trials we're seeing, it's kind of widespread across nearly all varieties now, is it?
Pretty much all the varieties that are going to be up for recommendation or recommended this year have some level. Now there's a difference in the amount of yellow rust that I'm seeing in some of the plots. Something like Champion is very bad for it, definitely. But there are some varieties there that only have a small number of lesions, and we'll be looking at seeing what resistance source they actually have.
So in some years then you can get Septoria that's bad in some years and not so bad other years, or Rinco is bad in some years and not so bad in other years. Is this just a year that's going to be bad for yellow rust and we're not really going to see it too much after this? Or is it a bit of a step change in terms of how we'll have to treat wheats in the future?
So I think it's probably a combination of both. It has been a bad year for yellow rust. It's been ideal conditions for it. However, we can look back a few years ago and people will be familiar with the variety Bennington. Bennington was very susceptible to yellow rust, and I think we have to treat these varieties like we treated Bennington, so that it's actually in most years we actually will have yellow rust in them. So in that sort of context, we probably are thinking about trying to treat yellow rust very early from an application of a pre-stem extension next year. However, at this stage, I'm sort of reluctant to say that it's actually a blanket wide, because we still have to get information on where this is, how it is broken down, and equally how is it going to develop into next year and what the weather conditions look like.
So it'll only be a month or 2 months before growers are going to be looking at the new variety they're going to sow for next year. How worried should they be in terms of what one they pick that's most susceptible or least susceptible to yellow rust? Or is it a case that, look, they're all a bit susceptible, but we can manage it?
I think it's probably a bit of the latter. I think the varieties that are going to be available are all going to be susceptible to yellow rust. There's going to be a small proportion of varieties that might have some resistance there, but everything else is going to be susceptible to yellow rust, or some level of susceptibility. The one thing I would say is we can control this with fungicides. We know that the majority of fungicides actually have some very good control against yellow rust. We just need to make sure that we're on top of it before it gets going. Chasing yellow rust is not something we want to do, so we want to prevent it. The chemicals work best in prevention.
So growers are going to have to be in their fields, all fields of winter wheat, in late February, a bit later?
They should be looking at them. Definitely in late February to see if there's anything there. If there's nothing there, everything's good, then you can delay an application. And again, it's about monitoring and understanding where is it in the local area, might not be in your field, has your neighbour got it?
When you're saying looking at it regularly, is that every few days, every week, every 3 weeks?
I think I would be looking at it every week at that stage, because the cooler temperatures, okay, its ideal temperatures are around that 15 degrees. But if you're talking about maybe the end of February, you're not up to that temperature yet, but it won't necessarily stop it from growing. But you do need to, once that plant starts to get growing again, need to be in looking for it.
So I suppose the message here that I'm getting from you, at least anyways, is it's probably going to be a problem next year. It's something that's probably going to be in most varieties, but as long as you're looking at it early and you're applying the appropriate fungicide early, so you're not chasing the disease, you should be good for the season.
Yeah, I think so. And when I'd say applying the appropriate fungicide, we know that actually if we're chasing yellow rust, we're going to end up using azoles. And if we want those azoles to be working effectively for septoria, we want to avoid that. So I think we have to be thinking about, okay, what chemistry we will be using at that stage. And it's more than likely preventative, try to get it before it gets in, and that's something like a strub will be used for that.
Great, Stephen. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode, and a big thank you to John, Richie and Stephen for joining me on the podcast. We'll be returning to more highlights from the podcast in a few weeks, so stay tuned for that. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then please recommend it to a friend or colleague, and don't forget to rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, visit teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.